At 0542, the sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon, but Laughlin Air Force Base was already wide awake. The flight line buzzed with the crisp rhythm of boots on pavement and the high-pitched whine of ground equipment prepping for the morning flights. Dozens of lieutenants, fresh-faced and square-jawed, stood in neatly spaced rows beside rows of T-6 Texan II trainers, each one gleaming under the rising South Texas light. Everything followed the script. Uniforms pressed, names stitched with precision. Instructors moved with practiced efficiency, shouting checklists and corrections. Cadets double-checked gear, adjusted harnesses, and glanced at their watches, counting down minutes to their scheduled sorties. Then she appeared. No one saw exactly where she came from. 1 minute she wasn't there. The next, she was standing just outside the hangar entrance, leaning slightly on the edge of a red-painted maintenance barrier, a small black notebook in hand. No rank on her collar, no name on her chest, civilian boots, loose cargo pants, and a dark gray jacket zipped all the way to her throat. Her presence interrupted nothing, but somehow, everyone noticed. Captain Mendez, the lead instructor that morning, glanced at her, hesitated, then offered a short nod. She returned it, unsmiling. That was all the introduction she got. The squadron was told only that she was an observer, that she wouldn't interfere, that she'd be around for a few weeks to evaluate protocol compliance on behalf of some oversight office. The cadets barely concealed their reactions. Most kept their focus on their gear, but not before giving each other sidelong glances. A few leaned closer to whisper while pretending to adjust their gloves. Some assumed she was admin. Others joked she looked like someone's aunt who'd wandered onto base by accident. No one took her seriously. She stood still as a statue while crews moved around her, watching everything but never speaking. She didn't flinch when a jet engine fired up 30 feet away. She didn't react when a cadet accidentally dropped a steel tie-down hook with a loud clang. Her hands, partially visible from her sleeves, were marked with long, faded scars, the kind that didn't come from office work or kitchen burns. But no one asked. At 0603, the first wave of cadets began loading into their aircraft, following their flight schedule with robotic precision. She moved slightly, just enough to gain a better line of sight toward the runway. Her eyes tracked each step, pre-flight walkarounds, headset checks, comms confirmations. She made a brief note in the notebook, then tucked it back into her jacket. One of the lieutenants, tall and tan, leaned toward his wingman and nodded toward her. He smirked. Probably auditing fuel logs, he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. The wingman chuckled. She made no sign she'd heard, but she hadn't moved from that exact spot in nearly an hour. When the second sortie launched, and the T-6s disappeared into the sky in tight V formations, she remained. She didn't look at the sky. She looked at the instructors, at the way they used hand signals, the timing of their commands, the spacing between cadets when they moved in formation. By 0715, sweat was already soaking through Under Armour shirts and Nomex flight suits. She was still dry. She hadn't taken a single step in hours, just watching, measuring. Still nobody spoke to her. She didn't belong, not by appearance or behavior, but somehow, no one told her to leave. Maybe because, even though she looked like she didn't fit, she carried herself like someone who'd already seen what came after the training. By the end of the second day, she had become a fixed part of the background. Same jacket, same notebook, same quiet stillness. She didn't speak during briefings, didn't interrupt instructors, didn't so much as nod when cadets passed her on their way to the flight line. She just stood there, always in the same spot, like she was part of the concrete. Lata. Jake Connors noticed her first. Connors noticed everything, mostly because he believed the rest of the world revolved around him. Top of the class, solid stick control, already being whispered about for F-35 selection before he'd even finished initial flight training. He had a way of walking like he was always 10 seconds ahead of everyone else, and he didn't like mystery. By midweek, Her presence had become a running joke. Connors dubbed her the Ghost of Laughlin, and others followed. During one pre-flight, he nudged his buddy Martinez and whispered, "You think she's CIA or just really into fuel line pressure readings?" Martinez snorted but kept his eyes on the flight manifest. Connors didn't drop it, though. He'd occasionally salute her with mock formality when passing by, exaggerated hand crisp to forehead. She never responded. Every time they launched a sortie, she was there. Every time they debriefed, she stood outside the room. She didn't take notes constantly, only occasionally flipping open the small leather-bound book to jot something, then closing it with a quiet snap. No one knew what she was writing, but it was enough to make people uncomfortable. In the simulation bay, while the cadets were running through emergency scenarios in the T-6 full-motion trainer, she'd stand silently behind the observation glass. Once, during a simulated flameout over mountainous terrain, Connors veered slightly off the published emergency route, improvising to shave time. The instructor raised an eyebrow. She made a note. Connors noticed and muttered, "Guess she's not a fan of creative thinking." At chow, she sat alone, not because anyone told her to, but because no one knew what to say. A couple of junior cadets tried small talk once, but she just looked up, expression unreadable, and they backed off. Connors joked that she must have won a raffle to be there, or lost a bet. The strange thing was, she never seemed annoyed, never rolled her eyes, never defended herself. She was just there, like a mirror no one had asked for, showing people things they didn't mean to reflect. The instructors weren't much help either. They acknowledged her like she was part of the program, but none gave details. When asked directly, Major Hollis just said, "She's here on official capacity," then changed the subject. That made it worse. Nothing spooked pilots more than unexplained oversight. Every time someone slipped up a missed radio call, an incorrect trim setting, a shaky spin recovery, there she was, watching, scribbling. Connors hated it. He hated not knowing what she wanted, or why she hadn't said a single word since her first day. The others started feeling it, too. A kind of pressure that didn't come from grades or instructors yelling. It came from not knowing what she was looking for. One morning, while walking the pre-flight line, Connors leaned close to Martinez again. "You know what bugs me? She never flinches. Not when jets fire up. Not when someone drops a tool. I think she's a robot." Martinez chuckled but didn't disagree. She never got in the way. She never offered suggestions. But when storms blew in, she adjusted her stance slightly to face the wind. When flight plans were posted late, she was already standing near the new board, reading. She moved like someone who knew how the machine worked. Not the aircraft. The system. By Friday, the joke wasn't funny anymore. No one said it out loud, but every cadet started double-checking their calls, rereading their charts, squaring their uniforms tighter before roll call. She hadn't said a single word to any of them, but it was like she was inside their heads. Connors stopped making jokes, not because he liked her, but because he realized she might be keeping score. At Aero 917, a two-ship training sortie was in the air over Sector Charlie 4 practicing engine-out glide procedures at 4,000 feet AGL. Connors led the flight in Echo 2-1, with Cadet Howell as his wingman in Echo 2-2. Weather was clear, light crosswind from the west, and Tower had them on practice frequency with expected recovery via runway 13C. Everything ran smooth until Howell's voice came over the comms, strained and clipped. "I'm feeling lightheaded. Heart's racing. Not sure what's..." The transmission cut out. In Echo 2-2's cockpit, the aircraft held altitude, but Howell's control inputs became erratic. From Echo 2-1, Connors noticed the wobble and called it out. "Tower. This is Echo 2-1. I've got a wingman in distress. Request vector, back to base. Medical alert, on landing." ATC responded slowly, verifying call signs, requesting confirmation. Too slow. Connors toggled the interflight frequency, voice tight. "Howell, can you maintain altitude?" No answer. Then, over a completely different channel. One reserved for internal base control. A new voice cut through the airwaves. Calm. Precise. Echo. 2-2. This is Sierra Control. Simulate engine out. Set prop to feather. Mixture cut. Throttle idle. You're gliding from 4,000, so bank left 10 degrees. Intercept the recovery arc at 90 knots. Maintain pitch. Trim accordingly. Flight lead. Take position high and right. You'll guide him in visually. Connors blinked. The voice wasn't from the tower. It wasn't from the sim instructors. And it sure as hell wasn't on any frequency the cadets had ever used. But it was clear, unshaken, authoritative. Connors followed the instruction without hesitation. Howell's aircraft stabilized into a gentle glide. Connors fell into position, radioed base again, and this time the response came quicker. Emergency crews scrambled. The flight returned in tight formation. Echo 2-2 landing. First, with a hard but survivable bump at 09:26. Howell was pulled from the aircraft within seconds, alert, but pale. Later, in the debrief room, Connors asked who Sierra Control was. No one answered. Out on the ramp, the woman in the gray jacket closed her notebook and turned away before anyone noticed the comms set clipped to her collar. She didn't smile. She didn't explain. But that day, no one called her a civilian. Not out loud. Not anymore. The hangar was quiet except for the rhythmic whir of fans overhead and the occasional metallic clink of tools being returned to racks. Connors walked in with the purpose of someone who had rehearsed every word in his head. She was there. Of course. Standing beside Bay 3, back to the open tarmac, notebook tucked under one arm, watching a mechanic secure tie-downs on a freshly parked T-6. He didn't waste time. That frequency wasn't for you. You had no authority to break into comms during a live sortie. His tone was firm, not disrespectful, but sharp around the edges. Cadet Howell could have crashed, and if that happened. She turned to face him before he could finish, her expression unreadable. She didn't raise her voice, didn't shift her posture. There was no challenge in her stance, only calm. If I hadn't spoken, Howell would have stalled trying to climb out of confusion. You'd still be in the air, watching your wingman spiral into mesquite trees. Her words weren't angry. They landed with the weight of something undeniable. Connors opened his mouth, then closed it again. Behind him, two other cadets, Martinez and Lee, had entered the hangar mid-conversation. They stopped short when they saw the exchange. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick. No one moved. She held Connor's gaze for a few seconds longer before adding, I didn't override command. I filled a silence that could have killed someone. Connor stood there, jaw clenched, hands fidgeting at his sides. He wasn't used to being corrected, certainly not by someone outside the chain of command. But this didn't feel like a correction. It felt like truth. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't have a comeback. She turned away, walking toward the shadowed end of the hangar. Connors watched her go, mind turning over questions he didn't know how to ask. Martinez stepped beside him and muttered under his breath, Okay, what the hell is she really? Connors didn't answer. He just stared at the place she'd stood a moment earlier, a line of sweat cooling along his back. He wasn't laughing anymore. It was 14:30, the sun high and relentless over the gravel training lot behind the main barracks. The cadets were halfway through a field exercise on tactical combat casualty care. Dummies lay scattered across the simulated combat zone, each marked with different types of injuries: arterial bleeds, gunshot wounds, chest trauma. Their objective: treat and extract under simulated fire, following the march protocol. Lit. Bryce was leading the scenario. He'd set the pace fast and loud, pushing for pressure under time. Cadet Lawson was crouched over one of the dummies, hands shaking as he fumbled with a tourniquet on what was labeled ephemeral bleed. Connors knelt beside another casualty, checking for airway blockage. Sweat streaked through the dust caked across their necks and forearms. Lawson tightened the tourniquet above the knee, but the placement was too high, close to the groin. He reached for gauze, preparing to pack the wound. From across the lot, she spoke, not a shout, just a steady, matter-of-fact tone. "You're compressing soft tissue. That bleed won't stop unless you shift 2 inches down and lock it against the femur." Everyone froze for a second. Even Bryce turned his head. He hadn't seen her approach, but she was there now, standing just inside the perimeter, arms folded across that same dark gray jacket. Lawson hesitated, then looked at Bryce. The lieutenant said nothing. He glanced back at the dummy, repositioned the tourniquet exactly where she said, and gave it a hard twist. The red light on the dummy's vest flicked off, signaling successful occlusion. She said one more thing, not unkind, just focused. "Always treat for what's killing them first. You don't need clean gauze if the bleed's still active." Then she stepped back. Bryce nodded once, almost involuntarily. No one said anything. But something shifted after that. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle. Connors noticed it first. The instructors stopped watching her out of the corners of their eyes. They started watching her directly. The cadets didn't talk to her, but they paid attention when she moved. She hadn't lectured. She hadn't taken over. She just corrected a mistake that could have meant life or death and done it like someone who'd seen it happen before. Later that night, Lawson said quietly in the common room. "That wasn't in the manual," Connors replied without looking up. "I don't think she learned from manuals." At 16:10, the cadets gathered inside the Joint Terminal Attack Controller Simulator Bay. The room was dim, bathed in the cool blue light of multiple screens showing terrain maps, thermal drone feeds, and elevation overlays. Today's scenario was a coordinated close air support exercise ground team requesting fire support from 2 A-10 Warthogs orbiting 10,000 feet above a contested zone. Connors had the JTAC role, calling shots for the fire mission. They'd been briefed on enemy armor moving through a dry riverbed on the north side of a simulated Afghan-style valley. He marked the laser target zone slightly west of the main trail, away from the structure that served as the notional school. It looked safe on the screen. Textbook placement. The simulated strike unfolded. The A-10s checked in, and Connors walked them through the 9 line. The instructor gave the green light. Everyone was focused, murmuring approvals until a quiet voice spoke behind them. "You'll get good effect on target, but you'll blow debris into your own Overwatch team from that angle." Everyone turned. She was standing just inside the room, arms crossed loosely, eyes on the terrain overlay. She didn't speak loudly, but the words landed like they carried authority. Connors frowned, half defensive. The instructor glanced at the screen, tapped a key, shifted the angle of attack 10 degrees east, reran the strike trajectory. The simulation updated in real time. This path placed the impact farther from the ridge and reduced backscatter. He turned back toward her, brow slightly raised. "That's correct. That's cleaner." Someone finally asked what had been on everyone's mind since she spoke. "Did you ever do JTAC?" She didn't smile, just said it flat. "I did, before we had GPS overlays, before we could call in drone loiter, when we used paper grids and UHF and hoped the guy on the other end didn't panic." There was a long silence. No one knew how to respond to that. She didn't elaborate, just nodded once, then stepped away from the screen. The instructors didn't stop her. The cadets didn't question her again. Something shifted in that moment, not respect earned by rank or display, but recognition of someone who had done it, long before it became a simulation, of someone who still saw the things they didn't know they were missing. At 11:43, the sky over Laughlin shifted from clear blue to a heavy steel gray in less than 10 minutes. A thunderstorm rolled in faster than the forecast had warned. Most of the cadets were mid-brief, huddled under an open canopy beside the aircraft staging area when the bolt hit. It struck with a vicious crack, slamming into the ground near the auxiliary fuel farm just south of the main flight line. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was sharp. Flames shot up 6 feet, licking across the edge of the fuel transfer hoses. A black plume of smoke curled into the wind, and then the alarms kicked in shrill and immediate. Cadets scattered. Some froze. One cadet tripped over a tie-down rope trying to run back toward the hangar. Connors was halfway toward the emergency cutoff station when he heard the voice. "Shut the main breaker. Panel 3, left side of the pump house. Now." It was her, the woman in the gray jacket. She wasn't shouting, but her voice cut through the noise like a command that had been given 100 times before. One of the ground crew followed instantly, disappearing behind the chain-link gate. Seconds later, the base lights flickered, and the low hum of the pumps went silent. She was already moving, hand pressed to her radio. "Direct P-19 Alpha and Bravo to Fuel Point Auxiliary 2. Approach from the north slope to avoid wind spread. Confirm foam suppressant system active before breach." The cadet closest to the flaming hose was coughing violently, trying to crawl backward. Smoke poured around him, thick and choking. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted in, dropped low, and grabbed him across the back. Her movements were clean, automatic. She locked her arms around him and rose, lifting with the practiced grip of a fireman's carry. With her head angled away from the smoke, she moved fast but controlled, guiding them both out and downwind in under 20 seconds. The P-19 ARFF truck screamed through the south gate just as she crossed the marked safe zone. Flames hissed as the foam spray blanketed the fire. Crew chiefs rushed to secure the area. She didn't say anything. She just laid the cadet down gently, checked his airway, and moved back to the perimeter before the medics arrived. Her face was streaked with soot, her jacket scorched at the cuff, but her expression never changed. The instructor stood near the command cart, stunned. No one had told her what to do. She had just done it. Connors watched from a few yards away. Jaw clenched, Martinez whispered beside him. That wasn't protocol. That was battlefield muscle memory. Connors didn't answer, but deep down, he agreed. She hadn't reacted like a civilian. She'd moved like a combat leader. At 1410, the base's operations room was tense with the low hum of murmurs and shifting boots. The emergency had been contained, but the adrenaline hadn't settled. The cadets sat lined along the back wall, uniforms still stained from smoke and foam residue. Across the room, instructors gathered in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones. No one was joking anymore. Colonel Granger, base commander, entered with a clipboard and a slow, measured stride. He scanned the room before speaking, his voice unusually quiet for a man known for barking orders. "Let the record show the auxiliary fire incident has been contained. Damage minimal. One cadet treated for minor smoke inhalation." He paused, and response coordination was executed by Ms. Morris. Heads turned. Cadets looked at one another. Jake Connors frowned. Ms. Morris didn't react. She stood near the corner, arms behind her back, posture relaxed but firm. That was the first time anyone had heard the commander use her name. Granger's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, unreadable. Then he gave a nod. That's all. Dismissed. The room didn't empty right away. Some stayed seated. Others leaned toward each other, voices dropping to conspiratorial levels. Lieutenant Bryce muttered near the whiteboard. That wasn't a textbook evac. That was tactical level triage and fireground control. You don't learn that running checklists at a desk. Another instructor, Captain Rios, leaned in closer. "I served Kandahar in '09. She looks familiar. Didn't they have a forward air control unit out there? Operated separately from main wings." Bryce shook his head. That wasn't Air Combat Command. That was something else. From the row of chairs by the wall, Martinez whispered to Connors, "You heard of Shadow Wing?" Connors hesitated. Vaguely. Black budget stuff. Unacknowledged units. He paused. But they don't actually exist. Martinez's voice dropped even lower. One of the old instructors said it. Shadow Wing. That's what she was. At the front of the room, Colonel Granger watched the murmurs unfold. He didn't interrupt. He just looked at Morris again. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Recognition. Not professional. Personal. She didn't deny anything. She didn't confirm it either. But she met his gaze evenly, and something passed between them that didn't need explanation. She turned slightly, her profile catching the edge of the afternoon light filtering through the window. For a moment, no one spoke. And then it became clear there were people on this base who now realized they might have been under evaluation by someone who'd once given orders in a war no one wanted to talk about. Connors looked down at his boots, jaw tight. He didn't know what she had done, but whatever it was, it had earned silence, and that was louder than any metal. At 09:00 sharp, the cadets assembled in the debriefing room, lined up in rows, boots polished, name tapes crisp. The room, normally used for reviewing flight data and post-sortie performance, had been cleared for something different. A formal tone hung in the air. Instructors stood at the sides in full service dress, something no one had expected for what had been labeled a program closeout. Connors stood in the front row, his face still showing signs of bruising from a fall during a ruck march earlier in the week. Martinez beside him tugged at his collar, eyes darting to the doorway. Whispers filled the air, low and quick. She's not just an observer. I heard she commanded units off the grid. Yeah, but that's all just rumor, right? Then the door opened. She stepped in. Gone was the gray jacket and civilian boots. In its place was a regulation flight suit, midnight black, with no rank insignia on the shoulders, no name patch over the chest. Just one symbol stitched on her upper arm, a cluster of stars formed by 3 angular lines. Subtle, silent. It didn't match any known unit crest. She moved down the center aisle with measured calm, chin level, her scarred hands no longer hidden beneath sleeves. The room stilled as she reached the front and stopped beside Colonel Granger, who faced the cadets. For those wondering, he began. This week's evaluation wasn't just for protocol compliance. It was part of a long-standing selection program administered beyond conventional command. He glanced toward her, then continued. I'd like to formally introduce Colonel Elaine Morris, retired, former commanding officer of Shadow Wing. The silence was absolute. Some cadets blinked. Others exchanged stunned glances. One of the instructors subtly straightened his posture. Connors stared ahead, unmoving. Colonel Morris didn't touch the podium. She didn't raise her voice, but when she spoke, her tone carried with it the gravity of someone who had spoken in chaos and been obeyed. You've spent this past month learning systems, procedures, tactics. You've practiced every scenario under observation. You've pushed limits, some of you past your breaking point. She paused. But what matters most in this profession isn't how you behave when someone's watching. It's what you do when you believe no one of consequence sees you. Her gaze swept the room. She didn't look stern. She looked honest. I've stood on flight decks with broken radios. I've called in fire missions using hand signals and flashlight codes. I've made decisions in the dark, not knowing if the people above would back me up or if they'd deny I ever existed. She let that hang there. You don't get to choose how others see you. Not in this uniform. You get talked over, underestimated, misread. That's the job. The only thing you can control is how you show up, how you carry your oath when no rank, no patch, no orders protect you. She turned slightly toward Connors, then to Martinez, then to Avery Chen in the second row. Then she said it. You don't get to choose how others see you, but you do get to choose how you act before they know who you are. She stepped back. Colonel Granger didn't speak again. He just nodded. The room remained frozen for a few long beats. Then the first sound broke a single breath released like a pressure valve. In that moment, every cadet in the room stood straighter, not out of formality, out of something else, something earned, respect without instruction, reverence without rank, because they finally understood who had been watching them and why. The final morning came with a stillness none of them expected. The cadence of training had ended the day before, but no one slept well. The assignment ceremony wasn't supposed to be dramatic, but something about this cycle felt different. The instructors were tight-lipped. Colonel Morris had disappeared after the debrief. The tension hadn't faded. It had just changed shape. At 08:30, the cadets stood in formation on the flight line. Dress uniforms pressed, boots clean, eyes forward. The Texas wind cut through the open concrete yard. Colonel Granger stepped out first with a folder in hand, flanked by the command staff. Behind them, Colonel Morris walked slowly, holding nothing. Granger began to call names, each followed by applause, nods, sometimes a clap on the back, specialized training tracks, intelligence, operational control, flight command. When he reached Jake Connors, he didn't look surprised. Lieutenant Connors, you are selected for Special Tactics Command, Detachment Echo, assignment effective immediately. Connors stepped forward, received the orders, and saluted with precision. The applause for him was the loudest. He had earned it. Everyone knew it. He returned to the line, chest high, jaw set, but his eyes flicked toward Morris, looking for something. Some acknowledgement. She gave him a brief glance. Nothing more. Only two names remained. Avery Chen stood quietly in the last row, hands steady, expression unreadable. She had never outperformed the others in timed drills. She hadn't led in the simulators, but she had listened. She had absorbed, and she had noticed things the rest had missed. Colonel Granger closed the folder. Colonel Morris stepped forward. Cadet Chen, step forward. Avery did. Her movements calm, unhurried. The breeze picked up, tugging gently at her sleeve. Colonel Morris didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You saw me, before I said anything, before you knew who I was. She reached into a small side pouch and removed a box. Simple, black, unmarked. Inside was a single patch, the symbol of 3 intersecting lines forming a muted constellation. She placed it in Avery's hands. You're not being assigned. You're being invited. Shadowing is not about rank. It's about clarity when no one gives you direction. It's about doing what's right when no one will ever see it. Avery said nothing. She only nodded once, slowly. She didn't look at her classmates. She didn't need to. Behind them, Connors watched, his face unreadable, not angry, not even jealous, just processing. Colonel Morris added one last thing, her voice low but clear. The difference isn't always performance, sometimes it's perspective. And with that, the ceremony ended. Not with a cheer, but with silence. A different kind of honor, the kind that didn't need to be explained. At 0612, the engines of the C-130 Hercules rumbled to life, low and steady, vibrating through the fuselage like a slow heartbeat. Inside, Avery Chen sat near the rear portside window, strapped in, helmet in her lap, eyes fixed on the runway that stretched out behind them. The morning sun crept across the tarmac, catching the metal edges of the hangars and the distant line of parked trainers. Beside her, tucked carefully under the webbed seat, was the small black box. It wasn't heavy, but it carried weight. Inside was the patch 3 muted lines intersecting, stitched in gray thread against black canvas. It had no unit name, no motto, just a symbol you'd only recognize if you'd earned the silence that came with it. She didn't speak. No one on this flight did. Most were headed to different assignments, different destinations, but none of them wore what she now carried. As the plane began its slow taxi down the runway, Avery turned her gaze to the horizon. The airfield grew smaller, the familiar control tower shrinking beneath the rising heat. In her mind, Colonel Morris's voice returned, not loud, not forced, but steady, a memory now stitched into her own thoughts. The most dangerous missions are rarely the ones people talk about. They don't come with medals or applause. They're done because they matter, and because someone has to do them. The C-130 gained speed. The wheels lifted. As the aircraft climbed, the base disappeared into the haze. The patch sat silent beside her. No ceremony, no fanfare, just sky. Avery didn't look back again. There were no goodbyes, no cameras, only mission orders, only trust. And, as the light filled the cabin, the story ended, not with a salute, but with the quiet beginning of something most would never see. Something carried in silence, for the right reasons,